Okay, so good afternoon. We're going to do another video today, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I really don't need these, not when I'm speaking. Uh, I want to talk about what's going on in the world today, but to do that, I want to do a little review first, so we can have sort of a context from which to proceed as we examine current events, and that's really what this series is about. It's about current events to incorporate a lot of the things that are going on now that are pretty grim, that do need to be looked at from an historical standpoint and from a future projection perspective as well. And that's hard to do if you don't understand what's going on before. So just by way of review, if we talk about the biggest problem in the world today, in my view, many other people's views, the presence of evil, whatever evil is. My definition of evil is enhanced, intentional, long-term, in most cases, pursuit of self-interest at the express cost of everybody else. That's evil. When you become more important than anyone and everything, and you do things that could hurt people and you don't care, that's evil. When you pursue policies that are injurious to the state or to the nation or to the nation's people, that's evil. When you kill people, that's evil. When you kill people, especially when there's no justification for it. And justifying killing is very hard to do. Has to be extremely good reasons for it. Like, for example, if you don't kill them, they're going to kill you. You could justify that probably by saying self-defense. But we're talking about good and evil. And the problem today is there seems to be really, at least prevailing in what's visible on the surface, more evil than good. And in some cases, a lot more evil than good. So how did that happen? Well, we're going to go back a little bit in history and look at how these things sometimes develop. So it didn't start, the problem between good and evil didn't start 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or even longer than that. It didn't start at the beginning of the Neolithic Age or the Old Stone Age. It didn't start really even at the beginning of what you and I would call the beginning of Cro-Magnon. We don't really know. But it's thousands and thousands of years before recorded history. That's when that we experienced it as a species here on Earth. And it probably goes back way before that. Because when God placed man on Earth, there was already an existing war, a fight, a struggle between good and bad, between good and evil, between physical forces and spiritual forces, between God and Satan, and God and his angels, and Satan and his fallen angels. I'm not going to try to defend that. I'm not going to try to give a long discourse on how it's theoretically possible. I don't care whether you believe it or not. That's the way I see it, and I'm not going to try to defend it. There's all kinds of reasons why I think it. But this isn't a philosophy course. It's not an eschatology course. It's not a prophecy course. It's not a Bible theology course. It's a current events course. And I will probably do some videos on why I believe what I believe later on. But for now, we're just going to start with that assumption. And I believe it's a true assumption because it's what the Bible says. And I believe the Bible, or most of it anyway. So we had this war, and the war continued, and it nearly destroyed mankind many times. And we had man in the Garden of Eden, an original sin, and they're expulsed from the Garden of Eden. Because they sinned, they listened to the serpent, which is symbolic of the devil, Satan. And so they're cast out in the outer darkness. And God says, you're going to work from the sweat of your brow. It's not going to be easy anymore. You're not going to have this lovely garden that provide you with everything you need. You're not going to have that. You're going to have to work. And your wife will bear children in agony and pain. And pain and agony and sweat become features of life from that point on. And so too does all the temptations that go along with how we try to avoid that pain and how we try to get advantage over others. And this is at the root of selfishness. And selfishness continues to be a major problem in the human experience from that point on. So, in the course of recorded history, and really going back a little bit before, perhaps, an institution known as the Kabbalah develops. Not sure if it started with the Jewish folks or another people, perhaps who may have preceded them in history. But our first real knowledge of the Kabbalah comes from the ancient Jewish Kabbalah. And there are two Kabbalahs, really. The original Kabbalah, which is to try and understand the mystery of God and all things. And then there's a magical Kabbalah, sometimes called an evil Kabbalah, competing Kabbalah, that tries to examine all things spiritual from a standpoint of getting what you want. In other words, selfishness. In other words, evil. So these two Kabbalists struggle throughout history. Now we can move a little bit further and we talk about, well, how does it manifest? It manifests in many ways. Everything from competition in sports to actual physical warfare on the battlefield, to one people trying to control or in some cases annihilate other peoples. And that's recorded in Scripture. When Joshua went into the city of Jerusalem after the death of Moses and the children of Israel left the wandering period of their history and came into the promised land, they had to fight for that promised land. It wasn't easy. And they had to conduct warfare. And that warfare became very bloody, and many kingdoms were wiped out. It was a genocidal perspective. By the same token, the Philistines tried to wipe out the Israelites. They too had a genocidal perspective hundreds of years later. When we get into the diasporas, like for example, when the Jews were forced out of Jerusalem and into Babylon during the Babylonian exile, many of them, if not most, died because they were transported in a pretty merciless way all the way across the deserts and into Babylon, which would have been an extremely arduous journey under the best of circumstances at that time. And under the circumstances of captivity, I'm sure it was horrendous. And many of them died. And while they were in captivity for the next 50 years, they lived in slavery, the ones who survived. And when the Babylonian Empire fell under Cyrus the Great, as the Medo-Persian Empire began to rise, he let the Jews return to Zion. And eventually, they ran into another problem. After the crucifixion and ascension of Christ, the zealots of Israel began to fight with the procurator and his troops in Judea. And by 70 AD, the Roman authorities had had enough of the rebellions and the challenges to their authority, and they decided to lay siege to Jerusalem. They sent in the 12th Legion and several other legions. They surrounded the city and they starved the people out. That was genocide. They starved them to death and eventually burnt a good deal of the city as well. But Jerusalem grew back. It came back. So we go through more history. We get into the Roman Empire era, and in the 60s AD, we have Nero. He likes to burn things too. And he burns the city of Rome to the ground. Some say so he could write a poem, watch it while it burned, and write a beautiful poem about, the terrible tragedy of it all, and how heartfelt agony that he experienced watching this lovely city burn to the ground so he could make more room for a new modern Rome on the ashes of the old. But of course he'd have to slaughter thousands and thousands of people to do it in a horrible burning inferno. Because many of them were trapped, they couldn't get out. Some could, some did, some fled. Some couldn't get out of those cramped quarters. The fire spread too fast and many people died. And some say Nero didn't do it. He didn't plan it, he didn't plot it, but many historians think he did. Either way, the Roman Empire is replete with genocidal behavior, including behavior expressly against the Christians. And Nero, by the way, blamed the Christians for that fire. In Diocletian's time, he was a very pronounced persecutor of the Christian faith and Christians in general. And a great many Christians went to the lions and the gladiators and were made fun of in the circuses, paraded, beat, and slaughtered during his reign. You could say that was a genocide. When you get into the Crusades period, you have characters like Richard the Lionheart, a very good military leader in many ways, was successful in his exploits, at least a lot of them. But he slaughtered a lot of his prisoners of war. He just killed them by the hundreds, and some say thousands. Just left them out, killed them. That was a genocide. If you move to 519, 520 AD, and you look at the exploits of Hernan Cortez in dealing with the Aztecs, it started out being a pretty reasonable discussion. The Aztecs picked up Spanish very, very quickly. It's almost astonishing how fast they learned at least enough Spanish to communicate with the conquistadors. And they were working on agreements and trying to find a way to get along, maybe conduct some trade. But it all ends in horrible treachery, where the Spaniards invite the Indians in for a large luncheon and then proceed to attack them. And before it's over, they're slaughtering each other en masse. And the big thing, of course, that killed most of the Aztecs was disease, smallpox. And some say maybe some other communicable diseases as well. But the biggest disease impact was the spread of smallpox throughout the Aztec Empire. But the actual killing that went on was indiscriminate in the battles, in the fight. And some would say, well, probably could have been done in another way. They could have negotiated in good faith, maybe worked out some favorable trade relations, but for some reason, Cortez had no intention whatsoever of even trying to do that. He wanted power. He wanted what the Aztecs had. They wouldn't give it. So he decided to slaughter them. He had superior weapons. He had cannon. He had troops who wore armor. The Indians didn't have those advantages. He had troops that were very well trained with swords and musketry. And they were organized, and they took advantage of their training and their superior equipment. And they carried out a genocide against the Aztecs. And it goes on. You look at the history of colonialism. People were treated throughout most of the colonial period by the great empires. And here we're talking Great Britain, the Dutch, to some degree the Portuguese, certainly the French. There were several competing empires through most of the colonial period. And this is when we're getting into the early modern era. And almost all of them carried out genocidal policies against the people that they encountered on other continents, Africa, South America, certainly Asia. They worked these people to death.